So today we have um, another DH Colloquium presentation, Teaching Digital History as a Historian in Africa. I think this is a little bit different from other presentations that we've had so far, so it's very interesting. Vincent Hiribarren is going to present. He trained as a history and geography teacher before becoming a lecturer at King's College in London. He is the author of two monographs on the history of Borno in northeastern Nigeria, and served as the director of the French Research Institute in Nigeria at the University of Ibadan from 2021 to 2022. And I'd really like to hand over the virtual mic to you, Vincent. Let me stop my share, and then you can take over.
Good morning, everyone. Sorry for being slightly delayed. I was on the tube in London and I was late. Sorry. I'd like to first thank Menno for his invitation here because I know that's the previous colloquia that you've been watching or listening to actually deal with quite different subjects. And I've listened, Menno, to quite a few of them before preparing my own paper for today. And mine is much more about thinking about what we teach to undergrad students. And that is what basically this is all about. As you will see as well, I trained in African history, which means that actually this will have a specific echo in South Africa. And sometimes, place matters. And I guess, the fact that many of you are based in South Africa today, I hope will have its own importance. So let me share with you my screen first. There you go. Start. So, Um, I will tell you today how I created a module, what I tend to teach in that module. It's a module on digital history. So the kind of digital methods I like to basically to present to my students. Let me just introduce to you the module very quickly. It's a third year module for undergrad students in the UK, in London, King's College London. Most of them tend to study just history. Some of them do study history and IR, history and war studies. Basically, I tend to have humanities students, basically. It's an optional module, which means that, I only have students who are interested in digital skills, and I only have 10 sessions, so I don't have much time. I created the module 2 years ago, actually, now, but I taught it for the first time last year. And I had two classes, which is why actually I asked Menno if I could give that paper before I taught my classes, and actually, sorry, after I taught my classes, and before I teach my next ones, so I can have your feedback as well, so that, I can improve my own classes. I give two different assignments, which I could talk about in the Q&A, I suppose, because I won't have time to talk about them now. A short essay, classical essay to write, and a podcast. I asked them to create a small group podcast. So what is this paper? This paper is a reflection on my own teaching practice. And as Menno said, I trained as a teacher before, so I was trained as well to, to think hard about, how what works and what doesn't really. And here, I faced quite a few difficulties here, and maybe we can talk about them together. In general, that when you worked, students were happy, but still, there's still a few things which could be improved as usual, as always. Um, as Menno stressed before as well, I trained first in African history, so I guess I'm coming from that background first. And there's also an importance of institutional, international context. I'm not going to tell South Africans that story. You know it very well. There is a story about decolonizing the curriculum. And a story of decolonizing the curriculum in general, even in UK universities. So that's something which is very, very important for us here. So it's very present in the way I teach. I try to change the way we teach.
Sorry, just
Before,
quickly
yeah, I go
interrupt.
try to change my presentation. Yes, sorry, I
Okay,
saw
you
the
got it.
message. Sorry
Okay,
about
cool.
that.
Thanks.
So I just thought I was just hang on. Um,
Sorry, now
there
we
you
see
go.
it in. Oh,
No, there you go. And that should be this one. There you go. Is that it? No way. Hang on. No way. Sorry, because I'm using two screens. I need to stop sharing that one and share the other one. Sorry. Give me 2 seconds. Um, No. Is that okay for you now?
No, I see it in presenter mode, I think it's called. So I see the two slides.
Ah, you can't see the other one. Ah, strange. Um, There are. What about now? No, is it not?
No, it's still the same.
Ah, can you still read it? Is that okay, or do you want me to carry on? Maybe. Hang on, let me just play something. Mm, mm, There's no on this one. I know there's not much I can do here. Uh, it's the sharing screen which doesn't want to share my other screen, basically. Mm. And like that.
Yes,
Yes.
that looks wonderful.
Apologies. Thank you. So yes, I was saying basically double background, basically myself being trained in African history and the fact that institutions in the UK as well try to decolonize their own curriculum. So there's an incentive for us to think about questions of race, gender, and the colonial past, especially in London. So it's got, it means something in London, definitely. That's the background, yeah. Um, so why this paper on digital history and African history? Arguably, here we've got two different fields here, and that's something which is rarely taught together. And when I tried to prepare for this module, I didn't find that many resources. You're going to see very quickly actually how I've done it. But digital history, as you know, is quite a recent field. Arguably started in the 60s, 70s in the US, but still very much a Western discipline just in terms of number of publications. It's not that accurate when you think about the number of projects being done now in Africa and South Africa, and I'll go back to them in a second. But still, as a number of publications and number of projects, it still remains a Western discipline. African history was also, depending on the way you look at it, was a way to write the history of newly independent nations. So it existed before, but it's something much more like created in the 1950s and 60s to prepare the history of independent nations and the subaltern and then the agency African populations. So you can see the idea was to get rid of Eurocentric narratives here. And I think that these two have something in common. I'll get back to it in a second, even if at the start, they don't have that much in common. As I just said, if you have a look at, resources available on African history, well, actually, at the start, it's, as I said, as DH is much more developed in rich universities, you're going to find more resources on, say, US history, including African American, so the history of the African diaspora, yes, but less so on the history of the African continent. And because historians working in many underfunded African universities don't have the resources basically to have stable internet connections, so that's the case in Nigeria where I was not so long ago. Basically, that's what happens here. We've got less resources available. Nine people less tend to work less digitally. And when I say people, I need to recognize that I'm talking mainly about historians because actually, we've got lots of specialists of linguistics, literary scholars, musicologists on the African continent who've worked on digital humanities. But again, historians are quite latecomers to digital humanities, and that's something which might also be might something which have an impact on the way I teach here. So there are a few, yes, but which actually gave papers in your colloquium, but not that many. And finally, a last factor, which I think is important to understand what's going on here, is that more and more, historians tend to write on the recent years, on the last few years. If you can see how people write on security studies, write on international relations. There are less and less people who write basically on the ancient African past before the arrival, the invasion of the Europeans, before the transatlantic slave trades, even before the European colonial periods in most of Africa in the 19th and 20th centuries. So somehow here, there's a tendency to produce online resources, but just on the last few years, on the 21st century, basically. So you can find, yes, publications on digital publications on the early 21st century, or digital resources on the early 21st century or late 20th century. But actually, beyond that, it's very hard to find projects. I guess that's, for me, also one of the factors explaining why actually we don't have as many resources as we would like. That being said, of course, first we've got to recognize, as I said before, the importance of the US here. Clearly, there's if you consider African history as being that of the diaspora as well, and that of the transatlantic slave trade, you can find amazing resources such as the transatlantic slave trade database, and you've got the URL here. But that's US are very important for us here, and in clearly in the whole. On the African continent, South Africa has also been a precursor here. Clearly, at the start of the 21st century, you had, this Aluka projects documenting the struggles for freedom against European colonial rule and against apartheid in South Africa. You also have the Zamini Project, which is still at the University of Cape Town, which still exists today. And that's clearly something which is worth mentioning. So the role of South Africa as well, the African continent. A few countries as well now try to basically carry on that work. And here I just put one website on archives of Nigerian radicalism here. So texts written by Nigerian leftists talking about the best way to change the Nigerian government. And Nigeria is a big country, so it's hard to believe from the outside that there's a strong left. But actually, there is one, and they write a lot as well. So that's a website, giving us this text basically. And also, there's lots of different projects as well on different parts of the continent. And last month, our colleague Frederic Mador gave a paper on the West African collection. But also, you can watch different colloquia available on your website, Meno, with one paper given by Caroline Schroeder on early colonial Egypt, by Amanda Ngwedu and Jacques Devet on Isikosa intellectual traditions, next amazing database by Philippe Strobel on the Bolivian Digital Project, so on gem dictionaries, basically. So it's like, there are lots of different projects, and some of them, some of them basically based as well in South Africa. So that's very, very interesting. Yeah. See, I told you before that, these two, African history and digital history, might not have much in common, apart from a few projects. But in my opinion, both fields pay attention to debates on imperialism, coloniality of power, or oppression in general. I use those terms because to give you a whole idea of how you can find them in the literature in African history and digital history. But I think that these two have that in common, because actually you can find in the field of digital humanities and digital history attention paid to oppression, paid to the question of infrastructure, the question of who owns what, and we'll go back to that in a second. And you can find that as well in African history. So, my main argument is that historians of Africa are in an excellent position to think about digital history, humanities, because we're trained to focus on patterns of marginalization and invisibilization. So you might think it's a very convenient argument to keep this paper, but I believe this kind of works. You're going to see, I hope you're going to be convinced today. I think that, historians of Africa can bring a critical dimension to digital history, and digital history will need discussion, critical questions about the creation and dissemination of historical knowledge on Africa. And I think these two can work very well together. And I hope that's what I'm going to try to show you today as well. So in front of you, you've got the teaching plan of my seminar, so of my module, sorry. You've got 10 seminars, as I said before. As you can tell, 2 of them are devoted to 2 workshops, which are loose terms to help my students create their own podcasts and write their own assignments. I tend as well to troubleshoot, issues they might have with the readings or to answer questions to finish last year. My seminar on Wikipedia actually lasted for more than 2 hours, so I used the fifth seminar to finish that as well. As you can tell, it's quite a classical way of dealing with it. I had lots of ideas, but basically that's what I did. Today, I'm going to focus on 4 weeks in particular, otherwise I'm not going to teach you the whole seminar. Uh, he didn't ask for that. The first one is would be about the fact that we can find many, many, many resources on the internet now. The second one would be on Wikipedia, classical one. The third one would be on databases and big data and how students handle this. And finally, something we've talked a lot in your colloquium as well, the question of generative AI. So I will start with week 2 on is internet a historical gold mine. And what I'll do is I'll show you the instructions I give to my students, and I'll try to interpret, to talk about the way they answered the questions with you. Basically, that's what I'll try to do with you. So see, for this seminar on internet as a historical gold mine, I asked my students to have a look at one of these two massive digitization programs. One of them hosted at UCLA. I used to be a board member, that's why I talk about it a lot. Another one at the British Library. It's called the National Archives Program. And myself, I had a few grants from the British Library to do these kind of digitization programs in Madagascar, Nigeria, and Benin. So I've done it myself, basically. And what I asked my students, is I asked them to criticize these online sources. And basically, I give them a whole, like, an A4 sheet, basically, where I ask them lots of questions. And here I selected 2 questions for you. And I try to talk about, these 2 questions. The main thing that students struggle with, basically, is to answer these 2 questions, which are, where are the archives physically located? Can you identify where the servers hosting the websites are located? Um, and here, why do they struggle? Because actually, first, it's most of my students tend to be 20 or 21. They tend to be digitally literate, if you use that phrase, and basically they tend to take it for granted that things will be available online. That's something which is quite interesting when you think about it. That obviously not everything can be digitized. I tend to remind them that, see, for example, not far from here, the National Archives of the UK have only digitized something like 5% of what they hold, so that's not a lot. But also, there's one thing which they fail to consider is that files exist somewhere. They are somewhere, whether the physical ones or the digital ones, and that's this kind of physicality of archives, whether they be analog or digital, is just lost, completely lost in most of their answers. Obviously, not all of them. Clearly here I'm just generalizing here. But it's very interesting how the fact that it appears on the screen, like my face will be appearing today on your screen, actually just to take it for granted. And here the fact that they can click and select sources is just a normal thing. And from these 2 questions here, I can ask them very quite interesting sets of questions. For example, who was responsible for digitization of the physical files, the analog files? Who paid for it, and this kind of stuff? Who looks after the files? Who are the archivists in questions? In question. Then, when I talk about the question of the servers, basically students forget as well that the files are hosted somewhere. And that's something very interesting when we think about African history, because most of the digital files dealing with African history tend to be hosted on servers located either in the US or in Europe. I've done a small digitization program when I was in Ibadan a few years ago, and clearly in Nigeria. And clearly, I tried to look for stable servers in Nigeria to respect the fact that these files belong to Nigeria. They should be on Nigerian servers. And basically, I failed. Oh, clearly, Nigeria is facing some difficult, well, some issues in terms of electricity supply and in terms of building infrastructure, but still, that's something which was difficult to deal with. So, see, these 2 questions that I think, were the most interesting ones in this kind of part of the seminar. And clearly, they led to us to reflection on the location of digital files and what we do. Where are the things that we work with? Where are they? And somehow I thought, sometimes that historians, I don't know if you've seen that, sometimes historians like to pretend that they discover files or discover things or stories. That's a story which is quite interesting for us, but actually, it's not true. Someone has thought about keeping those files in the first place. So maybe it's an administrator, but this work tends to be done by archivists, and clearly many historians tend to forget that. But also here in this case, what we could see is that historians, my students, tend to forget as well that people created these databases, people created these websites, and these files were hosted somewhere. And maybe in the same way, we're gonna maybe forget or minimize the role played by archivists in the same way we forget the role played by um, database, website creators, all those who worked to maintain this kind of infrastructure here. And that's something which is one of these kind of results of this first part of the module in the seminar. Sorry, in the second part of the seminar, I asked them to use uh, the Internet Wayback Machine. I'm sure you've used it in the past, so it's quite interesting to find, to have a look at the way websites used to look like. And here, I asked them to select one website dealing with African history. And to see its evolution. And basically, yes, clearly here we've got some interesting conclusions that which can draw. Of course, students are quite often amused by the old school look of certain websites, and even understand how some websites try to look retro as well, which is quite funny. But they can see very quickly with the interface of the Internet Wayback Machine how knowledge is accumulated over time, basically. As a series of edits, a bit like in Wikipedia, if you want, you can see the different edits in the Internet Wayback Machine, and that's very interesting for us because if we have a look at African history, as I said at the start, African American history was extremely big from the start of the internet. You can find a lot of different resources, teaching resources in particular for secondary school teachers in the US. Um, and obviously, you can find websites in South Africa as well. And that's something which they can very quickly, like, identify the regions where knowledge is being produced. They can identify what people are interested in, the subjects, basically. So it can be about slavery, it can be about colonization, European colonization, and that these countries tend to feature prominently. There's one thing which they don't tend to think a lot about. And it's quite surprising when you think about it. It's just a simple question of digital-born archives. How do we preserve material which was created digitally? And here, I told you in the first place that we talked about here, analog archives, digitized most of the time paper documents. And here we're talking about websites and who looks after them. And that's that starts they start thinking about who should think about how should we do it. I tend to use the example which is not an example in African history, but actually which is linked to it. It's the question of Me Too, the famous hashtag, the famous Me Too hashtag, which was on Twitter. Who's going to preserve this famous hashtag now that Twitter has become X and that Elon Musk has certain political views which might not be, let's say, in favor of people in favor of Me Too, let's put it this way. See, that's that kind of question, and I start thinking about it. But clearly here, there's something which needs to be done, and something for which I don't have a solution because clearly it reveals again these inequalities of power between those who can host servers, those who can't, those who can afford to have electricity 24/7, and those who can't, and so on and so forth. So that's again a question about this kind of stuff. And that students tend to be extremely interested in these questions and tend to think a lot about them. And some of them actually who will not study history after their BAs, and many of them tend to go into law or banking here in London. It's quite interesting. Told me that that's the one thing that I remembered, after the class. This question about infrastructure, basically. They already forgot. See, it wasn't so long ago. So I can answer my questions, of course, their questions later. Uh, Um, Now let's on to the week on Wikipedia. And that's something which is a classical one for people teaching digital history. One which, of course, is again about themes about decolonization of knowledge, which again is a very important one in South Africa and obviously in London as well. I tend to start with this figure dealing with the wiki gap, the fact that, which is quite interesting, that 90% of Wikipedia content is created by men, 4 times as many articles about men than there are about women, a blatant lack of black editors, even if we don't have figures for this. I try to look for them many, many times. But the setting by default is that a Wikipedia editor is a white man like me, basically. So how can a Wikipedia editor lead to the colonization of knowledge? Um, Students are first, something I forgot to write, are they extremely familiar with Wikipedia. They tend to use it for everything, and nothing at the same time. They tend to fact check a lot of things. Especially if you work in a history department, you tend to check Wikipedia quite often because it's not in Wikipedia. It's definitely not the enemy, but Wikipedia represents facts in a sometimes not neutral light, despite its claiming the contrary. Um, so clearly here there's an interest, a strong interest from my students. There's also a strong interest in the concept of the Wiki Gap, and students are very willing to start editing Wikipedia. Uh, and very quickly, I asked them to edit something that they are familiar with about their hometown, their school, their football, the famous favorite football team. Something which shouldn't be edited later. Shouldn't be basically shouldn't disappear within 24 hours. That's something which tends to happen on Wikipedia. But I also noticed very quickly that I did not feel confident to add to more historical pages, to basically think about historical pages in a different light. So basically, it could be about. I asked them to write about the Bono kingdom in northern Nigeria, which I worked on. So I've got lots of publications on it. I asked them to. Some of them wanted to work on Kenya because I had a few students whose parents were Kenyan. Some of them wanted to. One of them was South African, interestingly, and wanted to edit a page on the history of apartheid in South Africa. And the conclusion is that all their contributions on these pages were removed quickly as well. So not only did not feel very confident about it, they were a bit worried, but also those who tried had their content removed within 48 hours. At least when I checked with them the week after, most of it was removed. And what they added, I checked before. So what did they add? Debates in the historiography. You know how historians disagree between each other. They tend to try to add to that. And clearly here, um, what they wrote, I checked every time. We copied and pasted into Wikipedia with the whole formatting, the different ways in editing it. It doesn't matter, it was done properly. So it wasn't a technical question. But every time, basically after a week, the conclusion was that content, more, historical content, let's put it this way, was removed. So clearly, hey, there was a lesson learned. And I told you, we talked about it in week 5. Actually, that's what we did here. We tried to discuss the reason as to why the content was removed. And there was no, to prepare this paper, I tried to look for general reasons. There's no general reasons. Some people complained that it was too geeky, basically, it was too niche. Some others complained that it didn't respect the concept of neutrality. Uh, and that some historians had certain points of view which were not neutral enough. So it's a kind of like, endless cycle of, what becomes neutral or not. Basically, here the lesson was that, knowledge on Africa basically tends to be is still a massive battlefield, and I'm not going to tell people located in South Africa that, but it was extremely obvious, even here in London, basically, that's my point. And that, even debated points which were kind of, accepted by different historians, well, the debate was accepted, let's maybe put it this way, were, um, deleted, removed very quickly as well. So basically, everything which obviously is online for us is quite obvious can disappear. But that's also was a lesson as well for my students. Basically, they could learn that, um, what they do online can disappear very quickly. That being said, I must say that, I got to recognize the fact that maybe I didn't prepare this very well last year, and I need to be much more careful with the way they write their own, they prepare their own Wikipedia articles. I've done it in the past before with previous students, but maybe I should spend more time with them doing that. And actually, that's maybe for this year. Let's move on to another week, maybe, to see um, uh, what's going on here. Um, that's a classical one as well. Students like, learning about databases because they will use lots of databases in their job later on. And basically, I asked them to have a look at the transatlantic slave trade database. There's a classical one which you do, here in London for obvious reasons. You ask students to check basically. Where they're from and to check if there were ships with people enslaved Africans in from their hometown, for example. See, in my case, it was the case like from a port 20 k's away from where I'm from, for example. So students tend to be very familiar with these debates already. They are a generation they've known, Rods Must Fall in England as well. They heard about it. They were in school then, basically, but they heard about it. So they were not, they were maybe, I told them about the size, the number of people involved, when, and maybe, this. But yes, but that's not what they struggled with. What I struggled with was basically something that's, the interaction between what is a very academic type of database. It's very, it's very academic. There are essays written on it. There are teaching resources for teachers, and the kind of impact it could have on society. The fact that, digital history, like digital humanities, has a public-facing, dimension, and that's something which didn't really, uh, was linked with the week on Wikipedia for obvious reasons, but still, not until that week did we talk properly about public history. The fact that actually digital humanities, what we do, all of us, is not just for academics, is also for basically the wider public. That's something that many universities are extremely interested in learning, in knowing, but because universities want us to have, to disseminate our knowledge, and at sea, we are being assessed in the UK on this, and I'm sure it's the case in South Africa as well. The fact that we are being assessed on the fact that knowledge is not just for academics, but also can talk to a wider audience depending on what we do. And clearly here, the tension between the two, surprisingly, was not that obvious to most of my students. Clearly not. Maybe it's because they were based in London. Clearly, I need to take this into consideration. Some of them who were, children or grandchildren of people who migrated from the Caribbean or from Africa, actually were much more acutely aware of this, which is somehow which you can understand more, I suppose. But surprisingly, many most of my students do not, they didn't feel familiar with it, and still that's something which is for database, which is just didn't work out very well. One last thing as well, which I need to add, I guess I don't have much time to talk about it. Many of them had no qualm with the whole datification of the past. The fact that, we can count people who were enslaved, and that, it ends up in a database. The fact it can be quite a cold and even quite, um, um, yes, quite not very human way of reading the past, of understanding history, just to think about numbers. That's something which actually didn't trigger a big conversation. I see maybe I should have done it in a better way here. We talk a lot about datification in general in history, the fact that we turn historical facts into either numbers or variables that we put in our databases, and that's something which see, I didn't even write it down here. It didn't work very well. Maybe something to teach next year. Um, And finally, two slides about, generative AI and LLMs in general. Obviously, it's like, it's the big subject at the moment, and it appears, I talk about AI throughout the seminar, for example, when I talk about, Wikipedia articles written by AI, when I talk about AI helping archivists writing descriptions of the archives, I talk about AI, but still here we just focus on AI. And here, this like big question. I go back to it again. Who owns these large language models? Um, Students tend to be very quite familiar with the question about money. That's something I like to stress here. Um, they okay, if it's owned by Google, obviously, second Google might have a say in the results, or might have an impact on the results. Even if the experiment with Elon Musk's Grok recently may improve the country, but that's something else. Um, the one thing the one thing about sovereignty, I hinted at when I talked about servers, actually didn't work very well with them, and actually something which um, that I kind of struggle to talk about with them. And I use this kind of cautionary tale from Kenya you might have heard about. Don't know if you heard about it in 2017. Kenya basically hired a French company. It's a French group, Idemia. It's a big French group. Basically, used to be owned by the state. It's no longer owned by the state. To look after the biometrics for selections. And the promise would be that obviously that no one would tamper with the results of the election since it would be abroad. But actually, it's because it was abroad that actually the French company was accused of tampering with the results, and maybe not of outright rigging, but still, it led to the cancellation of the next elections in 2022, as you can tell with this newspaper article here. So that's quite a big thing here, obviously, and that's something which led to another conversation here again about sovereignty and the fact that maybe, you know, thinking about who owns and who has access, and where are the big, I show them the submarine cables, around Africa, for example, and show them where are they from. There's one of them called Equiano, so I show them the whole history of Equiano and what it means and this kind of stuff. So see, there's the whole, again, the question of infrastructure and the legal question, and these are the 2 points which, in my opinion, are the two things that which my students should explore even more, and which I should explain maybe more in a better way. A second thing about AI, which is obviously is the question of piracy, um, and why I talk about piracy. It's first because I want them to understand that LLMs can't be trained out of with nothing, and I told them last year about that Meta use pirated material from LibGen, and it was so that's quite interesting for us. It's also quite interesting technically speaking for us as well, because my students need to write a dissertation by the end of the year, so they need to know about plagiarism. But the big conversation obviously is about copyright, and I've got these 2 questions. If knowledge produced in African universities is stolen by LLMs without any compensation, how will African researchers work? How will they be paid? That's the big question. How does it work? And there's a dilemma here. Is knowledge produced in Africa absent from LLMs? How can an answer produced by an LLM be ever accurate? Because obviously it will reproduce maybe Eurocentric narratives. So it's a dilemma which I use for teaching. Obviously the questions are much more complex than that, but actually it can work. It worked very, very well this time. So it was a useful conversation to think about, not only, um, who writes what, but who owns what's been written, copyright in general, and where should, where should, where we should take our inspiration from, what should we really want to read about African history in general. And that's my job here, obviously, for obvious reasons. So I guess let me conclude now, because I've been talking for 33 minutes nearly now. First conclusion I had, the first very obvious one, which I started with, there's still a limited number of digital resources on the history of the African continent available for people teaching such modules. Obviously, this doesn't mean that there's nothing, and as I hope you saw, there's quite a few of them that I can use. So there's enough definitely for this module. Historians of Africa, I think, are in an excellent position to think about digital history humanities, because we're trained to think about these patterns, in general. I repeat my main argument, but I still think it's the case. It works very well together. I find. maybe it's just me. Maybe I hope you might disagree, but I hope you let me know what you think. As you noticed here, all my points tend to be quite theoretical actually than practical. What do I mean? I talked about copyright, talked about sovereignty, I talked about law, I talked about big questions, but and actually, questions tend to be, I hope they will be in the future as well about, where things are, who does them more, and so we need to think about, these two at the same time, obviously. But for the moment, as you could tell, we need the discussion tends to be more theoretical, and I hope that in the future we'll have more about, practical information about where to look at things and who to talk to, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to stop here. I would like to thank you. I'd like to apologize again for my being late. Thank you. Bye bye. Thank you. Bye bye. I'm here for questions. Sorry. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm.
I thought this was a really nice presentation. I was actually just wondering before we go to the chat, because at some point the chat seriously exploded, I think. Um, I think the course sounds very interesting, really for people to think about. So I was wondering, just as a suggestion, this is not a question, if you would consider converting this into a MOOC or something as well, so people can just kind of openly join it. It's just a suggestion.
That's an amazing idea. And yes, I didn't think about it before. Yes, yes, yes. I'm sure I could find even some money at the university to do that this year. Why not? Why not?
Okay,
Yes.
wonderful.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, I'm not sure exactly how to handle the chat because there's a lot of, especially when you start to talk about Wikipedia, I think there was a big explosion of
Yeah. So sorry. Yeah.
of comments. Just quickly going through, Derek said stable servers are a massive issue. So this was somewhere at the beginning of the presentation. Wait a minute, now my chat is jumping around. Um, where is that now? I'm worried when archives moved into the cloud, they become much more easier to erase. Um, Jasmine then talked about, curious if there are any thoughts about how to make digital-born archives easier to reach. I'm not sure if you can say something about that.
Find a comment page just to make sure I um what sorry so it's digital archives. So can you repeat the question? That's why I can't find it.
So the question was,
Yeah,
I'm
please.
curious if there are any
Oh yes.
thoughts as how to make the digital-born archives easier to reach. It's a big question for me personally in my research. That was by Jasmine Matty.
Yeah, that's a big question. I'm afraid I can't answer as a professional archivist here. I know that professional archivists are more and more trained to basically deal with digital archives, and I'm sure it must be the case in South Africa. I know in the UK you've got people archiving the tweets, for example, of the government. Why do I know that? Because I stumbled upon it on the catalog once, just randomly, and I looked for it after that. And it's just there. So the problem obviously is the mass of information. So who's going to do it and who's going to preserve what? That's the question. So yes, there's the Internet Wayback Machine, obviously, which is famous for that as well. So social media, websites. But many things are being lost, on a daily basis, I suppose. And that I don't have precise figures. Maybe some people in attendance might have, but it's clearly a problem.
Okay,
Uh,
thanks. Okay, so then I think during your presentation, the Wikipedia topic started. Um, so there are a lot of comments on that. Ingrid mentioning that there are editathons um, at UCT for the history department.
nice, nice.
Um, and then I think about the data being deleted. It's about source
Hmm.
um, uh,
Verification.
source verification. Derek sharing a picture on the African Wikipedians um, and mentioning about vernacular Wikipedia is underregulated. So that might be he's advising to
It-
write in vernacular language first and then moving it to dominant language. I'm not sure if you have any experience on that.
I do actually, but as a in a kind of private way somehow, because most of my students tend to be English speakers, but some of them speak different languages. And actually, I could ask them to start, doing that. That's an excellent piece of advice. Myself, I've I've done it because you might hear my accent. I'm French citizen, but I'm also Basque. So there are two languages. So I know if I write something in a Basque text, a few sentences, for example, it won't be edited. If I write it in French, it'll be edited later. So it's more likely to be edited. So yes, actually, so yes, yes. But I never thought of asking my own students of doing that because I'm sure so many of them write in different languages. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, I think then, Chris, you have a whole long text. Do you want to perhaps ask the question yourself or share that information?
Sure, I can ask the question. I hope, can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, that's great. There's a lot to think with here. And I really like there's a dedicated course. I wish we had more staff. There are only three of us in the whole history department with hundreds of students. So that does put some methodological constraints in having a focused course like this. I'm at a South African university, so at first year, 350 students, it's the limited no tutorial program, and then it goes down to 70 at third year and then honors 10, which have methodology. But I'm certainly thinking about for third year and honors about some of the more hands-on ways in which you've been thinking theoretically. So this comes down to the question. That was just giving you some context because that does obviously change some of the pedagogic approaches, assessments, and activities that I could do with my students, which I can't maybe do with my students, which you can. And I'm really, really interested in some of the student-led historical analysis skills that students can do, and particularly how different that might be within the digital humanities. And I'm thinking much more, I suppose, about accessing digital archives. And there's a lot particularly in African history, a lot of these archives have not been digitized. So I'm just wondering if there's been a physicality or you've thought about bringing a physicality into the course around the students actually going and looking at archival materials. I'm not sure how large your class is. And thinking would
Yes. Sorry.
theoretically some of the bits here, I know there's the historical anthropology around this with Anne Stoler, but I haven't read much about the sort of even historical anthropology or other approaches to dealing with digital archives. I'm sure there is work. And that has its own sort of embodied encounter with power, silences, and equal access. So could you reflect on some of the more practical elements you have in your module, maybe contrasting older methods and hope archives are still going to be important, the physical ones next to the digital, because there's a dynamic space of experiencing that, which could be at play here.
Yeah, thank you for your questions and thank you for sharing this with me. Yes, it's the two questions actually. The first one about the physicality. Yes, I was looking for behind me, like for archives. I photocopied myself a few years ago, and it's not. I didn't steal archives, I promise. Bring them to my class and ask them to compare them with online archives as well to see what they think about it. What tends to happen, obviously, is like beyond the difficulty of archives, is like students forget that they need to go sometimes to archive center to see what's around the archives, like going to a library and just and seeing what's around one book you want to read. It's like seeing all the books. It's the same kind of idea, basically. You need more context, basically. So yes, that I do, and it tends to work, and I can do it because my classes are quite small, as you can tell. So it's easy. Now, with the whole anthropological dimension of it, I didn't do it, and you're right, I should do it more. I know that many anthropologists in the last few years and not just anthropologists, but many other disciplines have talked about archives in general. And actually, anthropologists have done a lot of work with it, and still obviously, but others as well. And maybe there's this kind of approach I could take as well, and I should really do. The main problem I've got, to go back to my students' ideas, like my students want to find documents as if they would just by clicking on something they think will appear, and even like there's always the start of the year disappointment that not everything is being digitized, and that's the obvious. It's quite obvious in African history that it's not, but it's clearly that's something which I need to do more with. And I'd be happy if you've got suggestions. I'd be happy to basically think about them with you later after the seminar. Obviously, yes. So thank you, thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. I see the Wikipedia discussion is then ongoing. So I think that there's a question by Jasmine. So who decides what is niche on Wikipedia?
I guess it's just when I talk about some, maybe I use that phrase. Yeah, I use that phrase. It's me, my words. Maybe it's not the best choice of words, but I suppose when I talk about characters or places, see, I come from a small place. Arguably, it's quite niche. If I write about the school from my hometown, that's what I meant. Not so famous, I guess. That's what I meant. Yes, it wasn't a judgment or anything like that. Obviously, it was just the fact it wasn't that well known. As simple as that. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Derek, I
Yeah.
see a question
Yeah.
from you
Mm.
there. Do you want to perhaps chat more about Wikidata as a mechanism for historians to get their publication metadata out and seen?
I wish I could say much more about that. And our colleague was here last week, Frederick Mador, will definitely be able to say more. If he's here, I don't know if he's here today. Yeah, he's here. Actually, he could say much more than myself, about myself. I know for a fact that's just to answer very quickly the question, maybe Frederick, who's here, might be able to answer. I tried to create metadata for the different digitization programs I've done, and I used Open and Refined and this kind of things to create metadata, which we would use not only control vocabulary, but which also helped me, standardize the metadata I would create. But maybe Frederick will have more to say about it. Frederick, if you're here, yeah.
Frederick, your mic is open, but we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Or at least I cannot hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can hear you now.
Yeah, and maybe I just want to mention also AI could also a possibility to generate metadata. So I was experimenting this recently, but it also raised a lot of questions about biases that can be ingrained in LLMs. So yeah, maybe that's what I just wanted to add, because there's also this problem of it's time consuming to write proper metadata. So at some point for librarians or archival centers in the region, maybe AI could be a possibility. I don't know if it answered what you want, the question, but yeah, that's what I would like to say maybe about that.
Yeah, thanks. I know Derek, I just saw too late. You also had your mic open. I know that you've been playing with Wikidata recently. Perhaps you can actually answer your own question.
Sorry, that's terrible to set the question and answer it. But really, I am just exploring it, and I think we're all very familiar with Google and the H index and that metadata that goes along with publications. But I think there's a lot of scope to be exploring Wikidata and putting your publications metadata on Wikidata. So I'm very happy to help or run a workshop around that if people are interested. And as I say, I'm still exploring it. I wish I knew. I tend to blog rather than publish.
Here's a massive potential here. That's what that's what we should do. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I see Jasmine has another question. I was wondering if anyone has any recommendations regarding sources about the history of the internet itself in South Africa. I found it hard to find material, but feels to me it may play a part in the uneven nature of knowledge dissemination online. Not sure if you know anything, Vincent?
Yes, actually, I wrote an article a few years ago on the history of digitization programs in Africa. So that's niche, and that's but still, I show that that's clearly starting in South Africa, and I mentioned the Aluka project, but you can find the details there. Maybe if you give me 2 seconds, I can share it with all of you in the chat. Can I share files? I suppose. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, we can try.
I can try, but that's clearly that was very interesting seeing how and Aluka actually was now it's part of JSTOR as well. So here it's not internet, it's more digitization programs per se, but it's kind of linked for obvious reasons. But yeah, there you go. There you go. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. I see that we're kind of running out of time. I'm not sure if anybody still has any pressing questions. I don't really see anything. I know the whole discussion about Wikipedia. I think we might need to have another presentation at some point on Wikipedia as well.
It'd be great.
No, but thank you so much, Vincent, for a very nice presentation. I think it's a lot to think about. Yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. Let's
Thank
see if
you.
we can make this a bit bigger, for example, with a MOOC or, I mean, the whole discussion popping up. I think that was really good.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions. And yes, be in touch, please. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
thanks.
you. Thank you. Thank you, Menno. Thank you. Bye-bye.